Alison is an independent researcher and mom who, through advocacy in Philadelphia schools, discovered that the emerging financial systems catalyzed by the COVID crisis run on human capital, requiring massive digital surveillance apparatus and digital capture and control of every aspect of life from cradle to grave. Alison has been studying the working parts of the World Economic Forum's declared Fourth Industrial Revolution and the global takeover of industries and public policies by central banks, multinational corporations, big tech, technocrats, and billionaire-funded foundations. Please join me and welcome Alison McDowell.
Well, I'm so glad to be here. I felt like I've needed to come to the Salt Lake City area for a long time because there's so much of the research that I've done that is sort of embedded in this space. And so I'll just get started. So my friend said it was nice to sort of have a framing concept. So I did not even know that you guys were the Beehive State when I made this. But I do work, when I'm not doing my research, I work in a public garden in the city. And so I do have a soft spot in my heart for bees. And so I think that this is an interesting concept to consider in the context of what I'm going to say later on this evening. And so it might not be easy to read, but essentially what this slide is indicating is that, I'm not used to working on such a big scale, that they're doing genetically modified bees. And they are doing that because the bees are dying because of the environmental conditions. And so they're talking about the plan to engineer the bees to live within a chemical environment and sort of the ethics of that. And I think if we take a minute just to start and just like close your eyes and think about two worlds. One is a world where we engineer the bees to live in an environment where we have to engineer them because of things we've done. And then the other world is where we maybe fix the world and don't have to do that. And if we just like think about that for a moment, and like the legacy of the bees here, you know, and being a good relative to the bees. Because I think it's about more than just the bees. So I'm going to just start to tell you what I'm going to tell you so that you have some understanding. It's very big, and people are like, could you kind of make it an hour? And I said, there's a lot that people don't know that they need to learn. And so there's a lot of moving parts, and if you only understand any one part, you're not going to understand the danger of the other parts. It's how all the parts interlock. So I have to teach you about all the different parts like smart cities and innovative finance around human capital and digital identity and predictive profiling. Because any one of the parts may not seem that problematic. So essentially, this is my take, and I always say, I would love for someone to prove me wrong. Because being right about this isn't going to be great. So look at it with a critical eye and come at me with this. But my sense is I feel like there's this predator energy at work in the world that seeks to disconnect us from natural systems and the divine. And that the idea is to reduce life to this electrical engineering problem. And that people are working on this, and they are masquerading as benevolent actors, but in reality, they're looking to implement sort of a program of global slavery, whether or not they fully realize what they're doing or not. And a lot of it sounds really progressive. I actually come at things from a progressive side. It sounds good until you actually peel down and look underneath at how it operates. And so I think most people, the things I'm talking about, would not want to see these happen, but they don't know. And so if we can collectively actually look at the situation, look at the historical trajectory, understand where we are, that we could join together and actually create alternatives. And it sounds like food sovereignty and communal support, alternatives that would help us redeem sort of our past and build a better future. And so that's sort of my overall sense. And I come into this, again, as an East Coast recovering liberal, not really politically homeless at the moment, saying that I think that this is a moment of what we are up against in terms of all of the world's children and other life forms and even the unborn. What they most want is to keep people divided. And what would be the biggest opportunity to change the future is for people to come together. And I think coming together around children and community and being good relatives to the other beings that we share the earth with is important. So that's kind of my framing. So how did I end up doing this? Well, my child went through 13 years of the Philadelphia Public Schools. We're a large urban school district. It's predominantly black. We're very poor. And it's seen as a profit center, increasingly for educational technology. And so in 2013, the Boston Consulting Group came in and they closed 23 of our schools. And they laid off 3,000 teachers. And then about 5 months later, they said they wanted to implement a program to grade the schools. And it was schools, the public schools would be graded and the charter schools wouldn't. And it turns out that the money behind that process was coming from Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. So it was really about technology, and at the time they had a parent meeting in the summer, and they always have those meetings in the summer when people are away, and they want to say they had public input, but they didn't really have public input. And I showed up, and we said, this isn't fair. Like this, I was naively not realizing that things were broken on purpose. And so that was my foothold into this, was fighting for the schools, because at that time I felt that schools were important civic centers. And then it evolved into looking at educational technology and surveillance of children in schools, both for profit and for control of the curriculum. And then it became really, the sources of data profiling and data mining were not limited just to schools, because as a large city that is very poor, they were looking at mining poverty for profit, not just in education systems, but in healthcare systems, in the social welfare system, in other systems, so of keeping people in poverty and creating an apparatus around that. And a lot of these innovative financial instruments were coming out of the University of Pennsylvania. This global impact investment network that I'm going to be talking about was spearheaded by Judith Rodin. She's the former president of the University of Pennsylvania. She left there and went on to lead the Rockefeller Foundation. So she has very close ties with the headquarters of Comcast. We have a very strong telecom presence. We have a very strong, this business school, Wharton Business School. They cook up a lot of these equations. So that's how I came, I did some civil disobedience and trying to sort of change things, but I didn't go into this thinking that this is what how I was going to spend my 50s. It got much bigger than the schools. So mostly what I do is, my background is in art history and cultural landscapes, and so I just look at primary sources, and I look for patterns, and I look for material. And so I just look at what people say they're going to do, and I believe them if they're powerful people. So mostly I'm looking at LinkedIn's, I'm looking at white papers, I'm watching webinars, and the people who are rolling this out really don't think that there's anything wrong with what they're doing. And so they don't hide it, they just say it, and they don't figure that anyone's going to watch 4 hours of the World Bank and New America on blockchain. No, that most people aren't going to be doing that like me. But that's what I do. I look at grants and all of these things, and I map them out, and those little dots over there, those are dots that I make these maps on Little Sis. And ironically, it's actually funded by the wrong side, and they kicked me out, but I got a VPN. I got back in. So I make these very big maps. And over time, I've layered 4 years of information, so it's this layers of information over time that shows the interlocks. So let me see. Okay. So the history for me is important. I know you guys probably have a certain framing around the history. In Philadelphia, many people understand sort of very big myths about our city, the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. But I also come with the other parts of resistance to enslavement and other things that were happening in my city. So James Baldwin, this is a poster at our art museum, and it says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." So the stoop there in the middle, that's the stoop of William Still. He was led the Underground Railroad. He was a black businessman, and he helped 600 people get to freedom, and he documented their family history so he could reunite their families. And this is just an average row house in our city. And then onto the one side, this is a monument and headstones at Carlisle Residential School. So Pennsylvania, which is about a couple hours west of Philadelphia, pioneered the residential boarding system. So I think when we're understanding the threats to families and cultural erasure, it comes out of this longer legacy. On the other side is an image. We did a small action at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. So a lot of this is running through the Federal Reserve banks. Patrick Harker is the head of our Federal Reserve in Philadelphia, and he's a former Wharton professor and on the chair of Catholic Relief Services. So we go around and we do small rituals of non-consent. We just say, we're not consenting to this. No one asked us, and we actually don't give our consent. And so this was on my birthday. That's how I celebrated my birthday. We sang, and we said we don't consent. So my friend, who is a farmer where I work, and he's very, very spiritually grounded. He's Catholic, and I started telling him these things, and he's like, Alison, you're Jeremiah. And I don't really have a very robust spiritual practice, and so I had to go look it up. And I was like, really? That's not a really great assignment to get. But I feel like I'm a conduit for something, that I was put in a place to see things, to tell people. So I'm really here as a repository of a lot of information that is being shared with me communally from other people. It's building on the legacy of other academics and people who've gone before me. So this isn't so much about me and my research, it's about me hopefully sharing this collective. And my framework of how I look at it, this is a global program that's happening right now. And I feel like while the apparatus is the globalists, trying to create one unified sort of overarching homogenous approach to a technocratic, industrially designed society around the whole world, that we can both celebrate each other's cultures and have solidarity globally, have solidarity with the Indian farmers who are fighting their farm bills there, but then having local accountability. So I think it's these two things, and I've almost envisioned in my heart that this is like a peace movement of mothers, like a peace movement against AI. I always say it's the scrappy moms against AI. We're just a few scrappy moms against AI, and people are like, who do you trust, Alice? I'm like, I trust moms. It's most of us who are out here who are doing this work. It's the people who've followed me from the education space into this new pandemic biosecurity zone. And people need informed consent, because I think a lot of these things are rolling and they don't have all the information. So I'm just going to start off with transhumanism. The body as a legacy system. I have a friend, Paul, and Paul is always talking about we're at this moment where they're getting rid of the legacy system, which includes the human body ultimately as their goal. This is a, sorry, I'm not great with the clicker. The top image is an image from called the Moonshot Project. It's from the Japan Science and Technology Agency. So this is the Japanese government's program. It's integrated with multiple agencies. And this is their moonshot, so this is what they're talking about imagining. But they're saying by 2050, they're imagining a diverse society where you no longer are burdened by the physical burden of having a body and a mind in time and space. And then they have these images of, exoskeleton, which the Army's already developing, and that you can, walk with your elderly father through a robot, and, numerous other integrations of human computing cybernetics. And not just humans, but all animals and plants. So they're imagining this fusion of sort of cyber-physical connection. And they're actually have been piloting robots, remote work for people who are profoundly disabled or people who are in hospital, that they would work in a cafe through a robot. So you're in ALS and you can't actually get out of your bed, but you're working in society as a robot, but you're just serving coffee. So these pilots, and that's the thing in this cloud-based world, you have all these small pilot programs and maybe none of them all take off, but this shows the mindset of where people are going, and that's where I'm saying disconnecting from nature and the divine. And this is an image of these virtual reality headsets. And this is why I'm here. I mean, really. Because these are preschoolers in these headsets. This is in the UK, actually. The company that's offering these is actually not far from GCHQ. This is military technology, fundamentally. And they're talking about augmented reality education, because what the education system does, compulsory education, as I've come to understand, is really to feed people into the systems that are planned by powerful people. So that the current educational system, especially for young children, and the pre-K and the universal pre-K programs, is to prepare them for this transhumanist future, where they're living more in a digital world, in a digitally twinned world, than in their own reality. So, I find that really horrific. And the other thing is the blue screens actually limit your melatonin. And the melatonin is created in the pineal gland. And a lot of people sort of understand the pineal gland as sort of the sacred center, like your spiritual center is in that gland. So it's really interesting to imagine them. A lot of virtual reality education program is coming through UNICEF in Africa. They have Nubian VR. In fact, they have VR headsets. They say those children are never going to learn to read. They can just code with gestures. We'll learn how to do gestural coding. So you'll actually not read. You'll just sort of dance out, I guess, designing the digital prison. But we've got the Internet of let me go back. The Internet of Bodies, so that's a thing. This report was done by RAND. The primary funder of this report, he was the former board chair of Swiss Re Insurance Company. So this is all about risk profiling, the Internet of Bodies. So they're talking about the risks and opportunities. And I remember a couple years ago, it was the first time I heard about the Internet of Humans. And again, how many people, average people, do you hear about on the nightly news? Like, oh yes, we're rolling out the Internet of Humans with our 5G program. I mean, it's not commonly understood. And these are just a couple images in my neighborhood of the 5G. And I've seen tons and tons of towers here. But the thing about the 5G and then ultimately the 6G is that the waves don't go very far, so you need small cells like every 1,000 feet or so. And so like in my city, they're doing major installation and there's one on either end of my block. So it looks like these cylinders and these smaller pieces that are mounted on telephone poles. They're not all just the big towers. This is a report from 10 years ago. Ian Akildes is a professor at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech, they do a lot of military contracting. And so they're actually imagining this future of bio-nano things. I encourage you to look up the Internet of bio-nano things. There's a lot of interesting stuff that will come up. And so they're actually imagining the next iteration is this fusion where the human just interfaces digitally and electronically through your environment. Like it's too hard to talk to your Alexa, so you'll just think it. And but it's who is in charge of these technologies, who is ultimately in control. Because we were just hearing of some sort of mishap with an Alexa. You say something and other things pop up that were not intended, right? So what happens when that's actually beamed into your brain? And this is from 2010. And it wasn't really until the pandemic started that I was looking into nano robotics and graphene. So this is the EU project on graphene, and they're working on nano robotics for biosensors and neural interfaces. And a lot of it is triggered through electronic wave systems. Through, again, medical, but we're looking at a moment now with the COVID vaccine and mRNAs where we're looking at population level bioengineering, so the idea of like non-consensual medical procedures tied to nanorobotics and other things are maybe not so far off. Again, this is the way certain people look at the world, right? I mean, Microsoft is planning a planetary computer. And a lot of the planetary computer process is really about managing natural processes to capture them for profit tied to social impact investing, which is being sold as a green technology, but it's all digital and it actually is anything but green. Increasingly, this new fourth industrial revolution, which is AI, quantum computing, automation, synthetic biology, 5, 6G, Internet of Things, is looking at genomics. Like genomics and bioinformatics are really central to the synthetic biology program. So when you're talking about this planetary computer, it's both big things, but it's also really down to your smallest the microbiome even. They're mapping the microbiome and getting all of this sort of genetic sequencing on of that to feed it into a computer. And again, for me, I think there's different routes to go. And to me, this feels like trying to quantify something that is sacred. And maybe they never read Frankenstein. I don't know. But they're messing around in things they really don't have a full comprehension of what's going on. My friend Stephanie, she's very good on, she blogs at A Piece of Mindful, Steffers at Piece of Mindful. She does a lot with the military biotech and this iGEM, Internationally Genetically Engineered Machines. It's a competition for college kids and now high school kids, but it goes back to 2003. So if you're in this world, you know that these things are going on. Again, this is the page from the Moderna, the mRNA. They call it the software of life. You're just layering in that with the planetary computer. And then a couple years ago, the University of Washington, I think in partnership with Microsoft, effectively created readable and writable DNA data storage. So I believe it's artificial DNA, but that they're using DNA to do readable and writable data because the amount of the Internet of Bodies, the data required is far more vast than even Bluffdale can manage, right, in its present form. Too energy intensive, too water intensive. So they're working on the DNA. But if you imagine that you can read and write data into DNA, even though it's artificial, is there at some point that they've already said that the environment and the human will interface, right? So do we become readable and writable within our human bodies? And so this is from Utah. So this is BioUtah. My red square got off, but it's 1,000 life sciences companies. So there's 1,000 life science companies in Utah, and that's a lot. And so that's, all sorts of companies who are, their bottom line depends on selling their products. And their products either depend on people not being well, or selling their products to people who are well through bioengineering or modification or augmentation. And so, that's something to think about, because I did, I guess I don't have that slide, but I did a long talk with someone in Tel Aviv, because Israel is the startup nation. Like for the past couple decades, it's rivaling Silicon Valley with tech startups. And now they pivoted to this social impact nation. They're using their technology for social impact. And so what I'm trying to say is, you're growing your economy on something that could ultimately harm future generations, your bottom line. And do we want that kind of growth? Is that the growth? Is that where you want to put your resources? So, I was excited to come here because I knew that you guys were one of the first 4 nodes of the ARPANET, the predecessor of the internet, but I did not know that actually that whole idea was launched here, right? So this is from the history in 1968, that they all met, the government and scientists, at Alta Ski Resort to essentially sort of plot out the internet. So if you understand the Internet of Bodies, and we were just at the Merrill Engineering building at the University of Utah today, because I wanted to sort of pay homage. I thought maybe that's where it was. And, there's a nuclear reactor under there. It's pretty deep. And it's fascinating because actually their specialty later on was computer graphics and visualization. So if we start to think about what's coming with virtual reality worlds, there's quite a lot of interface. And I know that there's some other projects going on at the University of Utah. So, you guys are like a 5G test bed. You've got the smart cities. This is all linked to smart cities. And then, before fiber, like copper was really like a central piece. So you understand like the history of copper and mining here. It's all intertwined. So this is the finance part. We have a problem, and I kind of identify it as a plumbing problem, and we've seen it since the lockdowns, is that the wealth concentration in the hands, and power and influence in the hands of, several hundred billionaires maybe, and many of whom are tied to, tech and crypto and that sort of thing, have disproportionate power. And the way capital works is it has to move, it has to circulate, and that's why when the last economic crash happened with the housing market, they said, well, don't hold on to your money, go out and keep spending. Because if everybody stopped spending the money, the whole Ponzi scheme would fall apart. Well, so now it's like 10 years later, and it's way worse. And so we have all of these resources of people who have no money, and then you have some people at the top who have all the money. And these are just sort of a sample of a lot of the people who have a lot of the money. And I centerpieced Elon Musk and Jack Ma about AI, because again, we're sort of trouncing towards the singularity at this point. But we have Klaus Schwab up in the top, and we have Pritzker and Ronald Cohen. We have some other folks, Gates provides cover for a lot of people. But there's many other very influential individuals who are holding this money, including Michael Bloomberg, who's being set up to sort of run the global police state. So you need the liquidity, right? You need people, people are losing businesses. Even if people get these tiny stipends, that's not enough to keep the economy moving. So what has to happen is, just like the last time where they created financial instruments to sell mortgages to people who really couldn't sustain them under the terms that they went into, these adjustable rate mortgages that they knew were going to flop, they were packaging those as securities and gambling on them, these hedge funds. They were creating a game of gambling. Well, essentially what's going to happen now is that the only thing bigger than the housing market is people. And so it's people as human capital, citizens who will be reframed as debt commodities and predictively profiled as burdens on society. And again, it's this deficit model, but it is because that is what the global economy needs to keep its fluidity. Is the only thing bigger than housing is people. So I had been following this, pre-pandemic. I have a friend who's a professor at San Jose State. She's sort of in the belly of the beast. And so she's meeting with these people. And they're the pilot for a number of these projects, including pre-K. So right now the focus is a lot on pre-K, universal pre-K, and workforce training. And a lot of the workforce training is going to be tied into the post-lockdown, reskilling for jobs for the fourth industrial revolution. So this is a document from 2012 from America's Promise. It's Ready Nation and the Kauffman Foundation. And on this slide share, they say that they are going to turn pre-K debt into asset-backed securities. They just say it right straight up. So we're going to give you universal pre-K on the condition that we're creating financial derivatives on it. So this is all aligned to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, most of which are about managing poverty. Okay, if you haven't looked at the goals, it's worth it, because most people would think, oh, it's about the environment, it's about clean air. Well, there's about 4 or 5 that are about the environment and clean air, but most of them are about managing poor people, of which there are going to be way, way more poor people in the world in this post-pandemic apocalypse. So 4 is education. So these are aligned to goal 4. In 2018, global leaders met from all over the world in New York City in November of 2018 to talk about human capital finance and in pre-K and workforce reskilling. And you could only go if you're a pre-K advocate. You couldn't go unless you came with 4 vetted business people. They said, we don't want you there. And they rang the NASDAQ bell and had their message on Times Square. So they're packaging. This is from a document that's now since been pulled, but it's from an organization called Global Education Futures Forum, and I really encourage people to put this in the Wayback Machine. It was really the rabbit hole. I have a friend who was a teacher in Maine, and she's like, only look at this link if you're going to go down the rabbit hole. And I clicked the link, and now I'm here, right? And so this link, they had a map that said to 2035, this is how we're plotting out education. And it's a foresight document. So it doesn't mean this has all happened, but this is their headspace of what they're thinking. And it's a huge, there's so much in there. And people say, how do you know all this? And I'm like, well, I just read what they say they're going to do, and then I listen to the news because it all matches up. But they talk about things called people nairs, that you would have a portion made up of people, and that the size would depend on the quality of the human capital. And that's really, when we were talking about digital slavery, this is digital slavery. This is what's coming if we allow it to happen. And that's a big if, and I don't think it will, but people have to know. People have to know to refuse. The other piece is a student genetic passport, this idea that students will get individualized education based on their genomics. Okay? So now I will say I have a friend who's been doing a lot of fighting in New York City against medical mandates for vaccines for teachers and students in New York City schools. And the New York City schools had hidden their contracts for COVID testing. And so they finally filed lawsuits to get the contracts surfaced about what was happening with the DNA. And there wasn't anything in those contracts initially that said the DNA had to be destroyed, but they got that put in. But we're not too far off as they're collecting more and more genetic material in school environments with FERPA gutted and the privacy that is not protected by HIPAA when it happens in a school, of them coming up with super personalized education, right? And to me, most of this stuff is really built on a really deep base of eugenics. Okay, so I'm going to try to talk about social impact bond. I made some little videos, and I'm not great with the art, but there's not a whole lot of people who are talking about this in a critical way. They're not real bonds. They call them social impact bonds. They're not actually bonds. They are outcomes-based government contracts, pay-for-performance contracts that are tied to public-private partnerships. And the premise goes, and it's kind of founded on carbon credit trading, this idea of there's some bad outcome, so if we can put up money here to mitigate that bad outcome, we will save money. Okay, and from that money that's saved, we can provide a return on an investment for this early solution that's less expensive. So that's the concept. So in Salt Lake City, in the Granite schools, you guys had one of the first pre-K social impact bonds, the first pre-K social impact bond in this country. And the cost offset was special education. So what they said is, we will screen kids, and we'll find a pool of kids that are deemed to be at risk and of needing special education, which is expensive. And so if we give them pre-K, we think we'll reduce the number of kids that need special education. And Goldman Sachs backed that social impact bond. So they got some pre-K. I'm not sure if it was 1 or 2 years. It wasn't super deluxe pre-K. But at the end of it, the 100 kids that were screened into the program, only 1 needed special education. And even the New York Times and the Chronicle of Philanthropy, they were like, these metrics don't add up, because you're not going to get 99% efficiency on this thing. Either you were screening kids who would never have needed it because maybe English wasn't their first language, or maybe it wasn't that they had learning difficulties, or you were depriving kids services, one or the other. But you don't get to 99% of the kids succeed in this program, and then Goldman Sachs gets a nice tidy payout. It's laid out in the newspapers. But essentially what they say is that we'll reduce the need, and from this reduction, we'll get our investment back, and then a little slice of profit. We'll get a little bit of profit back. Not much, just for our trouble, right? And people say, well, why would you do this? There's not much money in it. Like, how do you make money privatizing social services? That doesn't seem super profitable. Well, I believe the answer is going to be in the hedge funds, because what I kept peeling back as I was doing more and more with the educational technology is it wasn't even VC firms. It wasn't even venture capital firms who were like investing in the new app, right, or investing in the new platform. It was the hedge funds specifically, and those are outright gambling. Like, hedge funds, really, it's just about gambling. They're not building anything. They're gambling on outcomes, and as soon as you securitize things, like securitize that debt, you can have people betting that there's a bad outcome. And a lot of this is tied in with what's called what works government, that's advanced by Michael Bloomberg. And they always say, well, we're only paying for it if it works. But once that debt is securitized and traded by hedge funds, there's somebody betting that it doesn't work. So, okay, so I will talk about these metrics. So this is a gathering, the Winter Innovation Summit here in Salt Lake City. It was hosted by the Sorensen Impact Center. Sir Ronald Cohen, who essentially was the father of British venture capital and the creator of the social impact bond concept. He was a Harvard MBA, but he's based in the United Kingdom. He's kind of the key figure. So he was at, Ronald Cohen was attending, and Jim Sorensen, they collectively gave the welcome address for this event. And it was mostly about recidivism. So the prison industrial complex is a huge cost offset. That's one of the biggest. So a lot of these are like, how do we reduce people from re-offending and getting in prison again? So this conference was mostly about that. But in the middle of this picture is this guy, Ian Galloway, that you'll see a lot. And he's with the San Francisco Federal Reserve. And it's no surprise that it's the San Francisco Federal Reserve that is pushing this, because it's all technology-based and data-driven based, okay? And so at the end, there was a Q&A. And that video has since dropped off, but I have the transcript from the Q&A. And there was a woman who was from the food bank. And she said, listen, you have all these solutions, but if people are hungry, nothing's going to work. Like, people need food, and you can't figure out how to put food in there. And so, like, how are you going to do pay for success? Social impact bonds are also called pay for success. How do you do that with food? Like, is there some way? And Galloway says, well, we haven't figured the cost offset for feeding kids. Maybe third grade test scores. Maybe that's it. I mean, and that's what I'm trying to say, because I do believe that there are people of like profound faith and charity in this community who would never say we're only going to feed third graders if we can find the cost offset for Goldman Sachs. But that's the reality of what we're talking about if we start to scale these programs. I'm sorry, we can't feed you until we find the line item. And I believe not only like the hunger, because hunger is impact 2, social UN Sustainable Development Goal 2, is that there's going to be a lot around diabetes and prediabetes and food control. And again, not that chronic illness isn't a problem, or public health issues aren't a problem, food access isn't a problem, but they're actually going to be weaponizing it against the communities that are most at risk of being food insecure, living in food deserts, and not having this access. And so the first health impact bond is being developed now in Sweden. And it's being developed, Jacob Warburg with SEB Group, which is a big financial group. Well, he went to Wharton, right? So you think of these big global actors, but when you peel back down there, it's all the same club. And they're looking at managing the food system with apps and nutrition apps and tracking, because it's all about getting the data. So how would you track the food system? And I know food sovereignty is big for you guys. You get a retinal scan. A lot of this is being piloted through humanitarian aid. Syrian refugees in particular, so they're putting their grocery bills on their retinal scan. They're getting that through the Iris Guard, and again, that's through the UN. And now they have stuff called Shop with Your DNA, the DNA nudge band. So we're building into wearable technology. That's part of the Internet of Bodies. So the Shop with Your DNA nudge band actually was developed by Imperial College London in their R&D spinoff, and now they're blending it with COVID testing. So the NHS in England bought like 16,000 of these COVID tests with DNA nudge bands, okay? So then we have this, which is an image from the state of Illinois in 2018 did a blockchain working group, and they were sort of doing a thought paper of like, how are all the different ways we could use blockchain wallets in government? And so this is their thought process around food, SNAP, supplemental nutrition assistance. So people who need food assistance, wow, what could we do putting that on blockchain? Well, we have a person who needs it. They have a benefit wallet, which is there in the middle, a digital wallet, which is, we're hearing more and more about these Fed wallets and the digital wallets, and that we will incentivize a healthy purchase by, if you buy the apple, we'll ding you back some cash, right? Beef by the hamburger, no, not so much. And then people are like, wow, well, that seems pretty efficient, right? But of course, this system is fully predicated on individual choice as opposed to any part of the structural problem, that people may not live where they're close to actually getting healthy food, that they're not maybe working 3 jobs, that they may be living out of their car, that there are a lot of elements in this. And then my gut is that ultimately the benefit will be reduced to the point that you will only get to the end of the month if you always make the right choice, which may be an impossible choice. And so you tie that into a retinal scan and a DNA nudge band, and maybe, you're genomically profiling people, and it starts to get really scary really fast, in my opinion. So the NAACP thought so too. And so in the summer of their national meeting of 2019, they actually passed a resolution that was opposing blockchain identity to receive social services as a requirement. And so for me, this feels very much in line in keeping with health mandates. Like, just as you should not be mandated to have, a certain health procedure as a citizen, you should not be mandated to have a digital identity to participate in government or to receive a social service that you're entitled to, and that includes education. So they did pass that, and it was passed first in California and then at the national meeting. And ironically, in this group of like 2,000 national delegates, the only people who were opposed to it was the group from Brooklyn, the Brooklyn chapter, and they had cut a side deal to do behavior modification, behaviorist gaming, AI, ed tech for special needs students in New York City. And they didn't think that was such a good idea, but everybody else voted for it, so it passed. So this is what I want to say, is like, once we recreate social welfare services as an outcomes-based contract, everything gets narrowed. And so as a parent looking at what was happening with standardized testing, because that's how I got into it, was trying to stop standardized testing and encouraging students to opt out, was that every education was reduced to a test score, like a 3rd grade test score. And we all know that that's not a well-rounded education. But it works for pay for success impact investing, right? You just pick one narrow thing, and usually the thing they pick, it's like the government working with the investors to pick the thing that's going to work for them. They're not going to pick something that's a hard target to get. They're going to get the easy target. So all of the services have to be put on an app. Like, that's why we're seeing telemedicine. That's why we're seeing schools on screens. That's why we're seeing teletherapy, is that if you had just social experiences in the wild, there's not fidelity. That's what we need, fidelity. We need it at scale. The teacher is not going to write every note down. The therapist is not going to write everything, like every data metric. And if you start framing these as investment opportunities, they want the data, because that's what they need to fulfill their deals. So that's what we're looking at. I have sort of a distillery of that these people are really being just reduced to their data. And I want to emphasize that most people who are in the social welfare system, who are teachers, who are healthcare providers, they don't want to be running that machine. Like, nobody goes into those like caring professions because they want to run a machine in an app. And so we have to mobilize people across these fields to fight for human contact outside of the system. But the system is being driven by the financial markets. So I will say, reproduction is a big piece of this. Like, they're trying to claim, again, think transhumanism. These babies now are going to be, by 2050, they'll be the 30-year-olds. So they want to claim these so that the young adults will be ready, right? And so really focusing on controlled reproduction. So Pay for Success was piloted, the Medicaid partnership in South Carolina. And this was done with Google money, and it was a partnership with Medicaid. And one of the features of this was that they had an app called Goal Mama. And it was developed by Pam Omidyar. That's Pierre Omidyar of eBay, his wife. She has a lab that does like sort of patient-compliant neural analytics. And it was about like how you interact with this content, right? And they would feed you content, and you would have to interact. And these were low-income women. And my concern is that at this point it's voluntary. But who's benefiting? Like, is this woman really benefiting from this app, or is the app tracking the person and tracking their compliance? And again, do we always trust big tech to tell us how to parent, right? And so to me, you're not solving poverty with an app. And I was in a meeting with people at Penn where these people were presenting, and I said, you don't solve poverty with a nudge. Like, that's not the problem. The problem is that 200 billionaires have all the money, that you can behave, you can ask people to behave every certain way, but it's not actually going to bring the money down to these kids. So we've got the contracts. I wanted to sort of just point out, this essentially just, I see, in Silicon Slopes, the serve part, right? And then, in Israel, the startup nation, impact nation, there is a need in people's hearts to want to serve their communities, right? And so what I'm trying to say is this hasn't all been put in place yet. We've got lots of pilots. But before we go forward, we need to know who's driving this machine, or we're going to drive it in a direction that's going to be really bad. In 1995, and if anybody in this room is good at corporate securities law, I would love to have some help on this, because I have this feeling there's something about this piece that's coming. President Clinton created the Philanthropy Protection Act. And it essentially sort of created some carve-out around SEC regulation for churches and charities. And ostensibly, it was sort of about building facilities, like when churches or nonprofits issued debt, and how that debt was treated. I have a feeling, understanding this machine and knowing that, Clinton did a lot of legislation enabling technological systems, that it may be actually used to finance social services through faith-based communities. And so, I want to give people a heads up on that. And let me just move these out of the way. The next thing that's coming, because eventually the governments will all run out of money, right? I mean, they're not going to have enough money to pay these contracts, and I think they know this, so they've developed something called an impact security, NPX company, and one of the women is from Wharton. And so they've essentially set up a new structure where it's a public-private partnership with no government. It's an outcomes-based contract where debt is issued by a nonprofit, an investor invests, and if they hit the metrics, a foundation pays them back. Which is kind of crazy if you think about most of the people who are running these big foundations are tech-based. So you could create a pre-K program and say, well, we're going to use Hewlett-Packard devices to track our pre-K data analytics, and Hewlett-Packard aligned investors invest in the product and they're paid back by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, right? Or you've got Dell and the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, or you've got Microsoft and you've got the Gates Foundation. All of these, they play both sides. And so essentially then the children or whoever is getting the service, the person who's in addiction or the person who is housing unstable, they become a battery just to run the money, which is crazy, but I think that's where it's going. And there's actually a platform that was developed in the UK called Alice SI. So Alice SI is a blockchain investment, you can invest in the poor on blockchain. And so I think that's where the people ne'er part is going to come from. And it's interesting because Nominet Trust funded that program, Alice SI. And Nominet Trust, their money is from the ISPs. So when the Internet of Things is expanding rapidly, they're going to be have lots of resources. And so they're the ones funding the poverty management. So again, this is just sort of speaking to the derivatives aspect of this. We just had the GameStop thing, right? So I used to keep having to point out The Big Short. And if you guys haven't watched The Big Short movie, I would highly recommend it. It's pretty good at walking through how the mortgage security crisis rolled out. But now we have the GameStop. And so at least people are understanding about shorting things, right? That just because we're saying what works government, once we securitize that debt, it's shortable. So again, I'm just going to sort of reiterate. So this is all based on austerity. Jeff Bezos does not pay many taxes, right? If we actually had taxes being paid into people who are accountable, then you could vote them in and out. That's one thing. But once we outsource to private partnerships, those are not really accountable to people at all. So this runs on austerity. You have the outcomes contracts. You pick a metric. It's going to be a metric that works for the investor and that is easy to capture at scale with wearable technology or screen-based technology. You've got the investors. You can securitize the debt, and then you monitor the people. Now, if you imagine the fourth industrial revolution, what's coming is they pretty much said straight up that they're going to automate a huge portion of the world's population out of their jobs. If people were not on blockchain and on surveillance, there would be massive uprisings, right? They are trying to get everybody trackable pretty quick before they implement their transhumanist program. And so this impact investing essentially legitimates surveillance, because if you're getting a service, you're going to be surveilled, and that includes children in the schools. And I think that they're going to end up with digital identities before too long. So then a third party, and this is how they make it look legit. Oh, look, a third party is reviewing our deals to make sure they're good. Well, in the deals in Santa Clara County, California, there were 4. There was a pre-K one, a third grade, a literacy one for mental health, and one for housing. The mental health and the housing social impact bonds, the party reviewing the deals was Palantir. Okay, so Palantir is Peter Thiel's company. They do contracts with Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Control, predictive policing, right? So these are the people who are reviewing his social welfare data, is Palantir, you know, the all-seeing eye. And then, again, the deal is paid or not, and the cycle goes on. So this all runs, this whole system of cost offsets is on interoperable data, because you essentially have to predictively profile people into being a burden, whether they're not actually have been a burden yet or not. You like look at this baby and say, based on your parents' zip code and education, and you're going to be this much of a burden on us. Let's fix you now so we can save the money. And you haven't even done anything. Like maybe you're a 3-year-old, you have not even done anything, but they've already said, oh, you're going to have all these problems. And they do that for the financial markets. So they need a digital identity system to aggregate all the data, both for the predictive analytics and to realize how close they were to the prediction. So, sorry, I'm not great on this. All right, so I just revisited an article from the New York Times from 2002. And I'd actually seen it first a couple years ago. It was around the Pokemon Go craze, because I was trying to figure out the augmented reality and surveillance. And the second part of the article was all about Oracle and Larry Ellison. And, you know, essentially, this is like the last line of the article. This New York Times journalist spent the day with Larry Ellison. And they were like, well, I have one question. In 20 years, do you think the global database is going to exist? And will it be run by Oracle? And then he said, I do think it will exist, and I think it's going to be an Oracle database, and we're going to track everything. So of course they had to do like a little Facebook Live outside the Oracle office here too, you know. But that's what we're dealing with. This was in 2002, so 20 years. 2022, we got a year, right? So these are the questions that we have to ask. And in the course of this article, this is 2002. The guy's saying, well, what happens with this database, like in terms of measuring privacy versus, you know, security? Because are you going to keep someone off an airplane because they didn't pay their parking ticket? Like, what's to stop that from happening? And he's saying this to a table full of staff, like high-level staff at Oracle, and he said they all just looked at their sandwich. And then when we ask Larry, he knows stuff. Like, everybody looked at their sandwich. And what I'm saying here now is that, like, and I'm sure these are all people who got a very nice salary and are very well educated, and they're looking at their sandwich. And what I'm saying is, like, we got to stop looking at the sandwich and actually look to see where this is going. And, like, that's why I kind of count on moms, no offense. But, like, look up from the sandwich, guys, because, you know, Larry already said, you know, we've got, like, a year and a half to go. So again, you know, they just announced the COVID vaccine passports, and you know, Microsoft and Oracle are part of that, along with MITRE and Mayo Clinic and the Commons Project. So you should really look up the Commons Project. If you hadn't seen it, it's Rockefeller and the World Economic Forum backed. It's operating, I think, largely out of the Cornell Technion campus in New York City. They're J.P. Pollack and Deborah Estrin are part of that too. So they're going to set us up in these biometric identity systems in a biosecurity state. And literally before the pandemic, I thought that it was going to come through school transcripts, because they have these blockchain school transcripts. I thought it was going to come through early college and community college transcripts. Dallas and Tulsa have those models. But that's a tiny fraction of people that would get on the blockchain. And this is, if you can threaten someone as a national security enterprise and get everybody on a biometric digital identity, that's going to be much more efficient. So this is all the stuff they want to track. This is a Boston Consulting Group document, proof of ID use cases, a frictionless future of identity management. It was for the Australia Post. Australia and Commonwealth Bank of Australia are working really closely with the World Bank on smart impact bonds. So they need all that data. It's all the interoperability for the predictive analytics and the verification of impact. But that's a lot of stuff. So again, this is from my little videos, but they want it all, right? Your permanent record. And they're going to sell it to you like literally as privacy, right? You know, look how convenient and efficient it is to have your debt and your land ownership and your credentials and your voting and your public assistance and your health care. It's all on one card in a wallet and tokenized. And so a lot of this is coming, this data-driven e-government. What Works Government is coming from that New York University and their GovLab. Andrew Young is part of that, and Stefan Verhulst. And so they did some white papers on blockchain identity systems. This is the one in Illinois. So the state of Illinois set up a blockchain pilot for birth certificates. So they want to get you early on. In 2018, the first blockchain baby was born in Tanzania. I think there was also one in the Netherlands. So essentially they gave a digital identity to the unborn child, to the mother, and then to the healthcare system, and they tracked all the prenatal care on blockchain for compliance. And I will just sort of point out that if you are, a lot of this is running through humanitarian aid, if you are, there are bad issues in terms of eugenics and reproductive justice and injustice around communities of color. So if you're in Africa and you're a woman and you're getting some sort of prescribed prenatal care that's coming compliments of global aid and big pharma, you may not want to be in compliance. Like your version of your birth care process may not be what they see, right? But you're going to be tracked with blockchain tokens on your compliance. And they actually pitched it, like there was a pitch saying like, oh, if you comply with everything, you can get an umbrella token and trade it for an umbrella. Like that's how they talk about people. So again, this Illinois blockchain pilot was through Evernym, which is local here. So that's the Utah connection. It was not the blockchain baby, it was the birth certificate project in Illinois. But just to say, it's not just Africa, it's also here. They put kids on blockchain in Cape Town, South Africa. Again, this is very racialized. It's coming through UNICEF. So again, it's a global scale. In a cloud-based world, once you get the pilot and you get the policies in place, the laws in place, you can scale that thing pretty fast, and having UNICEF on board is part of that. So this is called Amply. It's a pre-K blockchain app. They gave a blockchain ID to the child, to the school, to the teacher, and they would track attendance. So it was a reimbursement program. So every time a child attended a day in pre-K, the franchise provider got paid back. And in this, it was really sad because they were pitching this franchise pre-K to low-income black women as a business opportunity. But then once they buy into that, like once they avail themselves of that system, they can't say no. They can't say, no, thank you, we're not doing the blockchain thing here. They are forced into rolling with this. And it's just sold as an app. Like, oh, look, it's so convenient. We don't need paper anymore. We just do an app. But they actually frame it as children building social capital. That your child builds social capital on an app in pre-K. And my concern is that there would be metadata attached to that, right? Like, did they come inconsistently? Did they come late? There are like implications that can be made from the metadata attached, even to something as simple as an attendance app. So this is something I think a lot of people who are like working in the blockchain space may not be like fully cognizant of or thinking about it in the context of impact investing. So essentially you would say, oh, well, you've got all of your data locked up in your identity, like that's great, it's super private. But the thing is, MIT has developed this Enigma Protocol that essentially says that they can query on encrypted data. So they may not know you personally, like they may not profile you, but if it's a cohort of people, say it's a cohort of people who are getting a substance treatment program, a cohort of preschool children, a cohort of, mentally ill homeless people. Like as a cohort, they could still query on that data for the impact. My feeling is that they need this querying to run the impact markets and to both say it's private but then also get the impact data. But to me, what that says is as soon as we become a blockchain commodity, that we are going to live in the kind of world we're in now under lockdown where everything happens through a screen or wearable technology under data surveillance. It won't stop that part. Like having privacy won't stop your kid his education from being on a Chromebook. Data privacy on blockchain isn't going to stop you from having telemedicine take over the healthcare system. It's not going to stop those things. So we have to decide, is that the future we want? And if it's not, then we need to say it's not what we want because this interoperable data system is, in my opinion, a big piece of that. So again, we did a bit of a non-consent situation over at Bluffdale when this is the NSA's major data center. And it's really a sort of a one of a kind. It just finished up, I think, in 2019. It's 2014 to 2019. It was, $1.5 billion. You can't see it. It's these bunches of gray boxes. I mean, if you didn't know, it would just sort of look like a cargo center, but I had no idea it was right here in this valley. But you guys have a lot of data centers, again, and it'll be intriguing to see how that develops because all of this stuff has a physical imprint. While we might think virtualization is very efficient, there are physical costs to all of that, and in terms of energy and space. So to me, I sort of feel like it's a lot more about complying, even though they say liberation. Aadhaar was the first rollout for digital identity in India, and of course they had the forced cash reset where they made everyone turn in the $100 bills and then pushed them into digital currency. It's connected to their biometrics. But the Indian farmers are fighting for against their government around the Farm Bill and to claim that. And it's a very sacred fight. A lot of people are of the Sikh faith and seeing this as a sacred fight for their future of their food systems and their communities. But, so you get everybody on a digital payment system and then you turn off the internet, right? I mean, that's sort of what we're looking at in terms of who's controlling the cloud. In Australia, they've put the disability service on blockchain, and they talk about it as programmable money. So again, imagine you've got a digital Fed wallet and all of your systems, your food assistance, your housing, my gut is that universal basic income is going to be on blockchain. It will ultimately be programmable. And we're looking at things like we have huge issues with our public housing in Philadelphia. We have a 10-year wait for people needing housing assistance, which is tragic. And our housing authority lets the houses fall apart and then flips them to developers while people wait online to get housing assistance. And but meanwhile, they're shifting toward a private voucher system, right? And we're looking at Blackstone, which is the largest private rental homeowner. They came in the last crash and scooped up lots of private rental housing, right? And now imagine that all smarted up with a voucher and a behavior and compliance voucher, right? And then the scary thing is that Blackstone just bought Ancestry.com this summer too, right? So now they've got all the DNA. Right? And so all of these things get Black Mirror pretty fast. But if you imagine sort of reducing people to a barcode, and increasingly, this is the thing that worries me, is because I have a good friend who's brilliant at all of this, like AI and blockchain, video game design, but when you see all the pieces moving together and you see that ultimately it may start to get beyond the people who are programming it. It may develop a life of its own in ways that we can't fully comprehend yet. And so we really need to beware beginnings of turning ourselves and the future generations into a barcode. So again, I'll just touch on Utah is moving on blockchain voting. These other pilots include the blockchain transcript, as I mentioned, Tulsa and Dallas. They're working with Learning Machine and MIT on these blockchain transcripts. So keep an eye out, because I just heard you guys did. Competency-based education is moving forward, and that's all about getting blockchain credentials. In Chula Vista, California, they're actually, and I'm not sure that it's actually happened yet because I don't think the teachers have agreed to go back to school, but Chula Vista is a suburb of San Diego. They're a smart city. They're very much aligned with workforce-aligned education. Their compelling kids, or their plan is to have kids do a cartridge-based blood test for COVID and then put the results on blockchain. Right, so they're already setting up essentially backdoor blockchain identities on kids. And again, if this is happening in a school setting, it's unclear. I mean, again, blockchain is supposed to be private. I mean, it's fully private. So, but there's the HIPAA, there's the FERPA, there's these questions of, are we actually asking children to give us their bodily fluids to be able to have face-to-face education? That's kind of what we're talking about. Okay, so yeah, and the thing about the blockchain voting, my friend Jaquel had mentioned that Overstock is advancing that, but they were also getting money from the Soros Fund to promote blockchain. And the thing about George Soros is that in Open Society is that they have actually promoted this whole shift of the new economic thinking. He has something called the Institute for the New Economic Thinking that is essentially pretty much says that they're pivoting the global economy. This is from 2013, this video. He is actually funding Jim Heckman, that we'll talk about, who's doing the pre-K equations through this human capital and economic opportunity group. Okay, so it's a little bit odd because Heckman is at the Becker-Friedman School of Economics and he's funded by Open Society. So when I talk about coming together, we might as well come together because literally the people at the top are all coming together. When George Soros is funding the Chicago Boys, it tells you something. So we've got the hedge funds, just to touch on that. This is also from Global Education Futures again, new models of human capital investment in promising youth. So you hear a lot about opportunity youth, particularly youth 16 to 22 who are out of school and not employed. So that is a social impact target area. In the UK, because this is, again, it's global, it's also very colonial, so the UK, Canada, Australia particularly, over there the charter schools are called academies. That's sort of the privatized version, and their major focus of hedge funds. Absolute return for kids. I mean, that's pretty straight up telling you what they're doing. It's Arpad Busson, who's a French financier, and this is from 2010. But he had a fundraiser where 800 top hedge fund managers and bankers came to his event, for his fundraising event for charter schools. Now, like, just picture what 800 like a room full of 800. I mean, that's like a convention, right? I mean, I don't think they're just doing that because they're nice people. I think there's a market in that. They know that this is market shaping, and we're walking right into under the lockdown of the shift, the transition to this new market. So again, a lot of this is being enabled in public education through the Every Student Succeeds Act. They have a pay for success provision that was put in intentionally for this purpose. And so now we see CME Group, which is one of the largest financial derivatives exchanges, like funding low-income education opportunities, early math education. So, why are the derivatives, companies funding education? Well, I'm telling you why. So, and again, I wrote this in February of 2019, that they're looking at shorting children. Like, imagine shorting children and doing it in a way and using language that makes you seem like the good person, right? Like, because they want to give you the cardboard check or sign the thing and be welcomed by the Chamber of Commerce and the United Way and be the good people for funding pre-K. But really, it's about creating these bond markets. So, and I would just say, if we're advancing this in the idea of a smart city, and that imagine that we're looking at QR codes under lockdown, and that your rights and privileges may be governed by a yes or no at any given point. Does the door open? Can you use the smart toilet? Can you go in this store? That everything is a micro contract. That the world is mediated by micro contracts, and many entities in this are actually tied to global accounting firms. KPMG, Deloitte, Accenture are very deep in this space. So your world is mediated by every day you've got 40 or 50 micro contracts, including can you go out of your front door? I'm just imagining, but where this goes under this biosecurity apparatus, you've got a minority report. Like, what happens if someone has you in their human capital and someone's planning on shorting you? And I kind of talk about the bus. A lot of the smart technology is coming in through the public transit systems, that's doing edge computing. They're like, oh, it's great, you'll need it so you can have know when your bus is coming. But by the way, we can do a rider on all the police data reports. They can also use the same system that we're using for the buses. But what if you're gonna short you and that somehow the AI system reroutes the bus? You're waiting to get to that important appointment and and I'm just asking people to sort of think these through, because there are these interlocking components of both making gambles and then having your real life interface with smart technologies in ways that we may not fully appreciate how sophisticated they get. So this poverty management program is actually advanced by the United Way. They're a major player. They've been doing a lot in setting up the data sharing agreements with community schools models. The original program of ALICE, which is Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed, so to me that pretty much says the working poor, of which there's going to be way, way more after the lockdown. That came out of the Northern New Jersey United Way. So do you know where the hedge fund people live in the United States? It's mostly Northern New Jersey and Connecticut and New York. So the Northern New Jersey United Way came up with this concept. It's now throughout, all over the country. It's also called collective impact. And, these are the people. They make it look very cheerful. I think they even have games in VR headsets that you can pretend to be Alice. So it's quite sophisticated. But one of this image on the side I want to show, because I think, there are a lot of people that I talk with who lean more libertarian, right? And this is a paper from the Idaho Libertarians saying how to get the government out of your life. You'll put it on blockchain. And look, there's the church, and the church can invest in good people. And so what I'm trying to say is this really what we're doing? It's one thing, do you have faith-based people NARES? Do you have people portfolios for churches? Any given church, is that actual charity or what's going on there? Because I think that's, again, this road that we're starting down, and we're just saying, look ahead, because do you want to be a church that has a great portfolio of people capital, is that what we're doing? So I sort of imagine this blockchain. I kind of talk about it like my friend Lynn. We were driving through Dallas doing touring ed tech and different things, and we're how do we explain this? And I said, I think it's kind of imagine all of the Ivy League MBAs got together and they decided to set up a game that would ultimately profit militarized hedge funds, but the nonprofits would be the dungeon masters, and then we'd be pushed into this augmented reality video game life where the augmented reality is run by the CIA, right? And so that's kind of this framing that I'm imagining is oh, is this what we're doing? Does it look like, here, go in this maze, Alice, and see if you can get out the other end. So these are 2 books. Kevin Werbach, again, where I'm from in Philly, he's a professor at Wharton. His specialty is gamification and blockchain. So gamification is really key to this because game theory is big in the hedge fund space, and it's also about behavioral economics and nudging and surveillance and sort of getting people to do what you think in ways that they might not even be aware of. This is a video, and I'll share around if you guys have the email. I'll make sure that we share the slide deck for this. And this is a video worth watching. It's very short. It's 2.5 minutes. It's called Meet Kathy, your Pathfinder Community Care Coordinator. So in this video, essentially, it's Joe who's returning from prison, and they're saying his life will be better if his wife and child do better. So the wife and child get put on self-improvement pathways. The wife's is to quit smoking, and the child's is to get her asthma medication managed. And so essentially, their whole family gets caught in the system because Joe gets out of prison, and then now they're all in the impact field because really it's always these business opportunities about scaling. So this video talks about how when the mother or the child does the right thing according to the pathway, they go under the finish line, and ding, somebody gets a payment. So the impact investor gets a payment and the nonprofit gets a payment. But there's really no incentive for anybody to get off the pathway. And it's not the pathway you picked. It's somebody just showed up one day and said, this is your pathway. So my sense of this is that these are blockchain smart contracts. And this is what competency-based education. Did you fulfill the obligation? Check the box, now you have the token. And that transfer is going to transfer data and money to impact investors. So this is Kevin Werbach from Wharton, and he talks about the fact that in games, rules can be surprising. You might not even know what the rules are, or all the rules. You might not have all the rules. So ultimately, the best thing to do is to be the designer that makes the rules. And so I kind of feel like a lot of us are in a game, we're in the game, and we don't even know what the rules are. But somebody knows what the rules are, and they're being rolled out right now. So in Utah, again, I mentioned that you guys were, it's here it says, you became the leader in social impact investing. I don't know how many people know that Utah was the leader in social impact investing, but you are, and it's linked to the early childhood pre-K data. This is me standing in the Dirksen Senate building in Washington, D.C. The Social Impact Partnerships Pay for Results launch, which is essentially it's a mouthful, but they had tried to convince legislators for forever to give them seed money to start all these pilot projects. So they were toasting with champagne and strawberries. And the thing that really hit me hard was when I went down there with my friend who's a teacher. We were the only 2 regular people in the room. It was 200 people, all nonprofits. And all of the speakers were Republican, senators, but then all of the panelists were Obama policy wonks. So I'm sitting in this room and I'm seeing okay, all of the policy people, including the guy running the Nurse Family Partnership, Medicaid Goal Mama thing, and, and this other guy who's gone on to Connecticut and, where the new Secretary of Education's coming from. And they're all the Obama people, but then we're all in the room, and then 200 people who are waiting to cash in on this new model, right, of putting us on a pathway. And I even said in this, I said, listen, I got the first Q&A. I'm pretty good at this. And I said, I have a question. I'm hearing that there's these social emotional learning impact bonds for social emotional curriculum. And now I know with the pre-K ones, the kids stop getting watched at kindergarten because they get screened. Do they need special education or not? And so they get off being watched, theoretically, right? They're out of the deal is set at that point. But if you're doing social emotional curriculum and the cost offsets are addiction and incarceration, and you screen a kid in middle school into a program, when do they stop getting watched? And I said this to the panel. I said, is it 20, 50? When are they going to say, oh, you know what, you're never going to get addicted? Or you just always watched. And I think that's what the blockchain stuff is. It will just be locked in until some time triggers and you get booked, and then boom, it'll say, oh, that social emotional learning, we got to get our money back on that one. And it's crazy because after it was done, I had 3 consultants rush up to me and say, we can get an equation for that, handing me their business cards. And I'm like, no, it's horrible. Did you not get what I'm saying? It's actually totally unethical that you would do that in the first place. But all of these people have made a business on this. And it's shocking to know, and that nobody else knows that this is happening. So anyway, and Sorensen, Sorensen was at this event. He gave the opening remarks. So a lot of this goes back to Goldman Sachs. And this was at the Ready Nation. Ian Galloway is introducing for early pre-K investing. And they say, I've heard if you've seen one social impact bond, you've seen one social impact bond. And that's true with one exception, and that is just about every social impact bond out there has Goldman Sachs fingerprints all over it. They are by far the leaders in the space. They are creating this marketplace out of thin air, and I commend Christine and her colleagues for their hard work on that front. So, you guys got Goldman Sachs as of 2004. Gary Cohn was at the time, I think he's now moved on to IBM, which is very deep in the blockchain space, was president. He was on the board of Harlem Children's Zone, and this has all been piloted out of Harlem Children's Zone in New York for like 30 years. So Stanley Druckenmiller was board chair of Harlem Children's Zone. Jeffrey Canada was the director. And Stanley Druckenmiller was one of George Soros's hedge fund managers. And together they shorted the British pound, right? So these are the people that you want taking care of low-income families with wraparound services, is people who would short whole national currency, right, and make $1 billion in the mix. So Gary was on the Harlem Children's Zone board, and then Goldman Sachs at the time has been involved, like in numerous social impact bonds tied to incarceration, which were Rikers Island and Massachusetts Roca, and then pre-K impact bonds in Utah and Chicago. So again, you guys have had there's industrial banking, and that's something I'm still trying to get my arms around, but there are not many states that have industrial banking legislation. These are not regular commercial banks. These are other kinds of banks that just lend to each other, sort of innovation financial products. And they said that they assist charities and provide loans and grants, and that the most industrial banking corporations have been chartered by Utah. So you guys are the leader in issuing setting up industrial banking, of which Goldman Sachs is one. So again, Pay for Success is working in Utah. Strive Together was part of that partnership. It's linked to this idea of collective impact, which is running through the United Way. And Strive Together actually came out of, it was a spinoff of something called KnowledgeWorks in Cincinnati. And that's important because Cincinnati is actually also home to Procter & Gamble. My dad was like a Procter & Gamble exec. He sold Folgers coffee his whole life. And so I have I'm still atoning for that. But they actually invented the Internet of Things. It was like an Olay salesman or something, like a rep. And they developed like the RFID chip early. And they're like, that's great. Like, you need to go partner with MIT. And then they created the Auto ID Lab. And then there's now like 8 Auto ID Labs. So essentially, if you understand supply chain tracking, like, we are now the supply chain. Human capital is the supply chain. And so KnowledgeWorks was set up, and I will talk about that a bit later, to develop this, essentially the augmented reality education system. And then Strive Together was their Cradle to Career Pathway program. And Connie Ballmer, which is Steve Ballmer's wife, is on the board. Steve Ballmer, formerly of Microsoft. And they gave $60 million to Strive. Now, they're also developing the data dashboards for the data analytics on the kids. So Social Solutions is theirs, and that's part of, it's not an impartial interest that they're on that board. The Ballmers and Druckenmiller are also part of Blue Meridian Partners, which you should look up. It's a giant, giant pool of collective capital that's being aimed at pre-K right now. And they're moving in a lot of cities. So this is one of my maps, but you see Blue Meridian in the middle, Stanley Druckenmiller and Soros Management Fund up at the top. The Ballmer Group is part of it. Also, George Kaiser Family Foundation, they're linked to Tulsa and these surveillance play tables and Head Start, which I'll talk about. But it's these big foundations that are essentially setting up the policies, getting the policies in place for the bigger investments for the fund managers. So again, as I said, you guys know it's tied to Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of it is going to be called ESG investing, environment, social, governance, and you'll hear a lot about that coming out because it's supposed to be wonderful. We're gonna save the world. We're gonna clean up the planet. We're gonna solve poverty. Only it involves a lot of smart dust. We're just gonna put a sensor on everything and put it all on blockchain, and then we'll engineer it to perfection for Jeff Bezos. But we're looking at Bretton Woods 2. This is out of New America, so responsive, asset allocators, the SDGs and the ESGs go together. BlackRock and Blackstone, they're all very deeply into the ESG space. So again, these are just the rainbow. If you remember when COVID came out, everybody was about the rainbow. Put out the rainbow, put out the rainbow. I noticed that the stay healthy signs from the Chamber of Commerce, like wear your mask, are all about the rainbow. Like, these rainbow colors are definitely being programmed into the equation. And again, like you guys have a connection, you hosted the United Nations, fairly recently in 2019. So there's, connections there between the UN and Salt Lake City. Just a couple other connections. Powder Mountain. I have a friend who actually used to ski up there as like his high school ski team, and they would say, yeah, we just take the public bus up to the mountain or whatever. But the impact investors bought it. So Greg Morrow is part of Learn Capital. Tom Vander Ark, who is the global impact futures guy, like the crazy people scenarios. Tom Vander Ark worked for Gates, and he's part of that. He's colleagues with Greg Morrow. So they're into the education impact investing space, and essentially they've sort of set up their special club on the top of the mountain to plan their impact projects. And then we just visited this today, the Sorensen Impact Center. So, Sorensen is close with Ronald Cohen. So, there's a lot going on here. So just the Heckman equation, essentially, so this guy, Jim Heckman, he's out of the University of Chicago, he's a Nobel Prize winner, right? Esteemed guy. He came up with an equation that said, we will give you a 13% rate of return on early childhood investing. Actually, 7 to 10 for regular, and then with health data, you can get it to 13. And then they went up and down and sold it. He and J.B. Pritzker, who also funded him, the coast of California, selling it to community foundations and saying, this is great, this is a nice solid return, and you can invest in kids, and it's going to be great. And so this is from one of these presentations that he gave in California. It's a video that they presented, I believe, in San Diego. And essentially they said they couldn't really bet that the hedge funds are not going to work for, the data doesn't move enough for cognitive, because IQ hardens up around the age of 10. But character is what they can change. They can change character, and that's mobile, and that's their target of opportunity. And so, they're going to get this 7 to 10% rate of return on brainwashing children and their character. So this guy, this is in the room, the Social Emotional Learning Conference at the University of Chicago, oak paneled room, super esteemed. Heckman invited all these folks. He's with Otis. This is an ed tech company that's doing interoperable data analytics and is part of the MAP data partners. And he's essentially talking about tracking these big ocean 5 traits. So openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And he actually says in this clip, he's like, well, as a former principal of a Chicago suburban district, are we going to tell parents we're tracking their kids' neuroticism? No. He's like, we're going to say something else, but really we're tracking their neuroticism. And, you can, look, I'll send you this link, but look at this video. I don't want any of this to be true. But once you know it, you can't unsee it. So it's really horrible. And they're building these into these standardized testing programs. And this is just another one, like crisis text line. This devastated me. The woman, I was reading her LinkedIn profile, and she went from crisis text line to something called Loris AI. Loris AI was a call center training. And they actually data mined the sentiment analysis of the text, of the suicide call center text, to create corporate call center software. And people don't know this about where the data goes. They just don't know. Who would ever imagine that if you're really desperate and you're texting crisis text line, that somehow your data is going to end up in creating value for a corporation? And they even on their website at one point said that Loris, by the way, is a poisonous lemur. Who names their company after a poisonous lemur and then tells you that on the website? To me, that feels really dark. So this is just from the Ready Nation. Heckman was working with this guy, Robert Duger, who was a former fund manager for Paul Tudor Jones of Robin Hood Foundation, just feeding the Harlem Children's Zone. And so they gathered these leaders together, and this is where they say, a children's advocate or policy expert may only attend with a pre-approved team of at least 4 business people, but unless you're an international participant, and then you can just come, right? And so Sorensen, again, was there, and this woman who is the mayor of Boa Vista, Brazil, and I want to talk about why that is significant. So this is another thing, if you are operating the blockchain space, and I hope people will look at it, it's called Shanzai City and IO2 Foundation. So the Ampli pre-K app was set up with support from IXO Foundation, which is a Swiss company. IO2 Foundation, also called Shanzai City, is based out of Hong Kong. So they joined together on smart impact bonds, and essentially they were doing last mile impact verification with facial recognition technology. So they would say something like, we're going to score parenting, and we're going to take an iPad tablet into somebody's home and film you with your child like having some sort of scored behavior that would unlock an impact token that would be tied to a social impact investment. And so this is a diagram of sort of how that works in terms of the blockchain data collection system. But to me, like, that's pretty terrifying when you're talking about creating global markets and poverty, and then you're bringing like surveillance devices specifically into people's homes and judging their behavior according to, like, I mean, you know, who would have thought like normal behaviors that we have like would now become illegal or like frowned on, right? Like, so who's going to get to decide what this proper parenting behavior is? And this was backed with backing from the UN. So again, it's something that can scale globally. So this was in Boa Vista in Brazil, which is a rural area, and a lot of people say, oh well, I'm going to like move far away so this doesn't get me like the 5G. But it's coming from the satellites. Like, this is a very rural area, so I don't know if it was like they filmed it and then they uploaded it to somewhere where they had Wi-Fi. But these people were not free of it, even though they were in a distant location. The other thing is that the IXO Foundation data is feeding into something called Ocean Protocol, which is for AI. So that's another end. It's like, we're surveilling you and we're feeding the machine learning into a system that further refines artificial intelligence, right? Like, so we're training the AI with our lives in this weird way. So that's IXO and UBS Bank, which is big as Swiss Bank. And so again, the World Bank is starting to come up with blockchain bonds, which are called Bond I, and that's from 2018, and that's actually coming in partnership with Commonwealth Bank in Australia. So you start, again, impact tokens, blockchain, World Bank. Like, we know the World Bank is not on the side of poor people. And then this is what some of this stuff looks like. Lena, like they're going to have a word pedometer and say that some people don't talk to their children right, or they don't talk to them enough. So they're going to slip a surveillance device into their onesie. And look, like there's like a little pocket in that onesie that you can do that, so that the poor people, you can make sure that they talk to their children correctly. And they're linking autism, like surveillance stuff, to that as well. You know, so again, they make it look so happy, right? Like, here, just read a book, like while someone is listening to you and scoring your behavior. This is another crazy thing someone just sent me, Moxie. So Moxie is like a robot your kids are supposed to play with. And the person who sent me this said, like, look at the comments. The parents are so excited because their kids are so desperate for companionship from being like locked down that this seems like a great option. Well, the thing is, there's another equation out of Teacher College, Columbia University, that they did one for social emotional learning for 11% ROI, and they're doing the social emotional stuff. So, like, they want you to interact with a social robot so they can get the data for their social deals. It's not about, like, play. It's this guided play, and imagine it's behaviorism. It's straight up Skinnerin. This is another one, We Play Smart. So these are in place in Tulsa. These are in place in EduCare, which is a franchise Head Start program. And in North Tulsa, on the 100th anniversary of the race massacre, they have Head Start kids on pre-K surveillance tables. There are 2 fisheye lens cameras on that table, and the children play at it together. They're supposed to play not alone, but together, because they're scoring the social behaviors, and it's scored with a rubric, which is what you can see below. And then they even have, it says the We Play Smart table is equipped with the patented Hatch authentic photo login that enables valid progress monitoring. So essentially, they're just like logging in with their face. You know, it's like, here, just give me your face so we can get your data, so that like JP Morgan Chase can get their payment, their impact token, while you play with this device on a surveillance play table. And for me, in the childcare space, if you imagine, like, I know in our city, like, childcare is very expensive. There are a lot of low-income women that have children in their home, like 5 or 6 kids, and if they're going to be regulated out of business, and my understanding is that's happened largely already in Washington State and many other places, they're going to push kids into corporate franchise daycares or these Head Start daycares, because if they come in and say, well, you have to have a surveillance play table or you won't be authorized to take care of children, well, then that's not only going to push all of those children into those systems, but it's going to take away many small businesses of independent business owners. Again, the health data analytics, remember there's that extra 3% if you get the health data. So we're looking at things like smart playgrounds. So imagining smart, like, Fitbits connected to integrated playgrounds. There's also literacy attached to playgrounds. So you're supposed to do augmented reality in these playgrounds, many of which are tied to, like, the Swiss company. The parents play with their phones and tell kids what to do. It's like directed play with QR codes on the playgrounds. And Bezos, I wrote an article when he set up the Day One Fund in 2018. called Montessori Inc. And I encourage you guys, I blog at wrenchinthegears.com. That's my blog, Wrench in the Gears. I also have a YouTube, Alison McDowell does on YouTube. But I wrote one called Montessori Inc., essentially speculating on what an Internet of Bodies pre-K was going to look like. So now he stepped down so he can focus on his philanthropic projects. Wait a minute, did I have, oh, and I missed that. The one in the corner by the drums, these are these little slippers. So this is from a franchise Montessori pre-K program in Boston, the Boston area. It's called Wildflower Montessori, and they actually put Internet of Things sensors in the kids' slippers so they can track them in the classroom. So they can track to see, like, who are their friends? How many times do they talk to the teacher? Are they in the block corner? And that's where the wearable technology becomes a problem, because this stuff is branded really nice. Like, it's like, oh, you get to sit on a wool rug and there's natural light and plants and wooden blocks. And by the way, there's sensors in your shoes. And it's high-end, and they want everyone to aspire to think that that's cool to be tracked, because they care about the whole child. They really do. Again, this is surveillance education. I want to point out to people who are doing homeschooling how these digital vouchers are going to affect the homeschool and unschool community. So you may think you're going to get your kid out of this system, right? But the reality is if they come up with digital education vouchers in your wallet, any provider that's going to accept that voucher, there's going to be an obligation of data return on that. And so all of the resources that you used to use in your community, your libraries, your sports centers, your community theater, your maker spaces, your art classes, if they take that voucher, there's going to be data that's going back. And it says so right here. This is from KnowledgeWorks. This is foresight. Again, it hasn't happened, but this is how they're saying. A smart ID badge would provide access to community resources like libraries, maker centers, and learning hubs, and perform transactions on behalf of the student, transferring money from accounts, gathering distributed student performance data for learning records, and providing an educator support team with the learner's location and task information. And so again, we're seeing a lot more concerns around child protective services on kids who are not logging in to their online learning, right? And bringing more and more families under into the crosshairs for intervention, because the kids are not being tracked through technologies in their learning process. But even if you're doing unschool, what I'm saying is, like, if you're doing the voucher, then essentially communities are going to have to build a whole parallel universe of places that don't take the vouchers. Because our library is central to this whole program in Philadelphia, our public library system, and it's really devastating. But so the interoperable data is key, the clever badges, and you can see the transhumanism branding even in that, because this child is virtualized into a cartoon figure with the QR code. So Clever was set up because essentially the kindergartners and the little kids couldn't log into their passwords on their online learning fast enough. Like, the teachers would wait half an hour to go around to all 30 kids and get them all logged in. So they said, oh, the answer is just a QR code to hold in front of the camera, right? So like, they can collect readily all of the data, and it would be collected interoperably. The other piece of this is that we can track it. A lot of the wearable technology and the out-of-school time learning will be tracked through XAPI, which is essentially allows... Earlier, it was SCORM, like Shareable Content Object Reference Module, and that was online learning that was going on laptops. But the XAPI could allow it to come from phones and tablets and wearable tech. And so it's military technology. It was developed by Problem Solutions under contract to the military. And they describe this XAPI as learning happens everywhere and we can track it. Okay, so if you understand surveillance education, military technology, and this idea of signals intelligence through human environments in education, that's a pretty ominous thing. I went to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and saged Problem Solutions as well. So we do not consent to the We Can Track It education module. But this is what they say. KnowledgeWorks, which is the parent organization of Strive Together, that this is what the future of education is. Like, pretty darn confusing. Like, we're going to kill off bricks and mortar schools. You're not going to actually go to a building. Like, the little kids will probably be with the Boys and Girls Club and the YMCA on a Chromebook with AmeriCorps. And the high school kids will be wandering around, whatever. We don't really care. We're not really interested in educating people because we're automating most people out of jobs anyway. And, imagine what that looks like if you're a single parent. Maybe your first language is not English. You've got a special needs child. You don't have a car. Like, okay, so I'm coordinating 30 competency-based opportunities for, like, my multiple children in this learning space, which increasingly, if you understand the world that we're living in, is like militarized policing, really, in this biosecurity state. And I think many of us who aren't used to being sort of under this level of surveillance are feeling it a lot more now. So again, Niantic is looking at an operating system for the world, and they want to make it sound really fun, this augmented reality world. We're going to have a complete overlay of the world, through augmented reality. And, we're part of this. The Knight Foundation is supporting this, and they're like, it's playful cities, only we're not going to tell you it's funded by In-Q-Tel, the venture capital arm of the CIA, and Michael Crow is running the game. Again, we don't know that we're in the game yet. But this is what's coming, and so if you imagine the unlearning in XAPI in the CIA's augmented reality world, it's a slightly different scenario. Again, this is just talking about Strive. This is the Promise Partnership of Salt Lake. So again, these community schools are looking at data aggregation on the families. And this is just augmented reality, sort of mixed reality world, the mixed reality world that they're aiming for. And they're aiming for, essentially, for us to sort of identify as avatars and cartoon characters. And this is actually from something, this is it's called Ready Player Me. And so it's talking about selfie avatars that people love and connect emotionally with. And that's like pretty scary when they start talking about it's for both gaming and virtual reality, like working, really, like that we're going to work in this transhumanistic way in augmented reality spaces or virtual reality spaces as avatars, but they want us to love the avatars. They want that love that process to happen. And we've already seen it in Class Dojo. They're priming the kids for that. This is sort of classroom behavioral compliance. It's a very popular platform where children are assigned avatars, and then they earn good behavior script, essentially, that they can buy things for their avatars and outfits and things. And that's part of this grooming process into the next version. This is like really sad for me. This is Waterford Upstart, which is based in this area too. It's online preschool. And I could not imagine at the time what online preschool would be. Like, why would you even do online preschool? And they're like, well, it's better than nothing. And in Philadelphia, they're actually piloting it on refugee families. Okay, and our library is a partner in that. Like, oh, it's great to data mine pre-K kids and get them ready for surveillance kindergarten, I guess. But I'll just read this out loud. It says, 4-year-old Charisse Parrish sits cross-legged on her living room floor, working on early reading activities on a Chromebook in her lap. Even though her home, located on a remote parcel of rugged land in the Red Desert wilderness of Monument Valley within the Utah side of the Navajo Nation, has no running water or electrical power. So again, this is how we're treating children. Like, they can be data mined for impact commodities, but they actually can't get drinking water in their house. And that's why I'm sort of coming out here to say, like, we're better than this. We need to be better than this. We haven't been, but we need to be. So the future of work, this was a really disturbing paper I found, again, at the United Nations, advancing a concept called globotics. They're talking, I'll just read this, as various forms of virtual presence technology are combined with human-controlled robots, an expanding range of manual services could be provided at a distance. At the high end, technicians could conduct inspections or undertake repairs from remote locations. So that's the stuff that was like coming out of Fukushima and the robots, right? But nurses in the Philippines could care for the elderly in Japan through a robot. Or at the low end, hotel rooms in Oslo could be cleaned by robots controlled by cleaners in Kenya, and lawns in Texas could be maintained by robots steered by Mexican gardeners in Mexico. And so this is the thing, like when I say that we need global solidarity, we totally need global solidarity, because this idea that somehow we're going to like close our borders and protect our people from this onslaught is not thinking about globotics. People are not talking about globotics, but this is not a crank paper. This is the United Nations saying that this is the future of work. And this future of work relies on blockchain credentialing, because it's going to be micro work assigned based on reputation score and skills accreditation through AI, likely. And these gamified human resource platforms, and they want trust, quote unquote. So the blockchain gives them trust. So they'll say, do you have the qualifications to mow this lawn in Texas? Show me your 50, do you have your updated credentialing for the lawnmower certification? And you'll have to have that token, or you won't be able to compete for the job. And then the competition will be for the lowest possible wage around the world once you have robotics. Once you have that. And I don't know how long it will be before they actually can do that. But there are things that I thought would take much longer. I thought I had 10 years to explain learning ecosystems and XAPI technology, and it seems like I don't have that much time. So these are the things we need to be talking about when we think about blockchain credentials and international globalized labor. And again, it's a global program. It's like the OECD and the UK. It's across the world, so it's a global problem. We need to deal with it globally. This is an image from a slide share from JCA Solutions, which is a defense contractor in Orlando. Orlando is a big center of simulation. And they're training these kids in a virtual reality headset to essentially like be Amazon warehouse workers. And again, with augmented reality, your micro work may just give you enough knowledge to run one part of a complex and advanced manufacturing process, but they don't want you to actually build another machine. They don't want you to know how the machine works, because you might build a different machine and like compete with them. They want to keep you on your pathway, like grasping for work, and you don't actually even have to know anything. They're just going to say, put up this tablet and we'll tell you what to do. You don't even have to know how to read. Just push this button. They don't want a thinking population, because a thinking population is not going to submit to the cyborg avatar capitalism model. Again, out of the VR, because I think increasingly they're going to start pushing that once they get the price points down, people are not realizing that there's data capture. There's biometric and emotional data capture coming off of that. This was from, again, this JCA slide share where they're saying the competency is how to pet a dog correctly. And so they break down what it is to pet a dog correctly, all the different steps. You have to demonstrate it with haptics in the VR headset to trigger that you've successfully completed that task. But meanwhile, it is capturing your physical location, your heart rate, the motion, your biometrics, your task completion, your hesitancy. They can sense all of that. And if you understand that these impact markets are also looking for measurable behavior change, like imagine them putting you in a VR headset and like brainwashing you and then like measuring the metrics and saying, well, the avatar metrics got better, so someone like we triggered the impact payment, right? Like that's I don't think that's too far off. So again, this relates to the competency education. The badging and the blockchain credentialing and the globotics are all connected into these competency systems, which you guys have underway and many states have underway. This is what education looks like for Pavel Luksha. Pavel Luksha is the one who created Global Education Futures. He's a transhumanist. He works in Skolkovo, which is sort of like the Silicon Valley of Russia. And it was like this isolated person. And like, think how lonely this person is. And when I saw this image about 3 years ago, I thought, oh, I don't even know what half this stuff is. But I mean, it includes biometric monitors, reputation scoring, investments, the VR headsets, family learning, like look at family university, because you're always doing lifelong learning because someone's going to be gambling on your pathway. You're never going to not be allowed to learn offline. That's what's, and then he's a transhumanist. I mean, that's the thing. Pavel Luksha, he's a straight up transhumanist, and he says this like in his stuff. So these are the people that are running the education program. So again, the data analytics, Canvas and Instructure are part of this larger data aggregation system, a local player, and a lot of questions about data privacy in that. And so imagine that their work-based learning is going to be one of these impact markets. We have pre-K. They're also going to gamble on if you get your badges, right? Someone's going to gamble on if you're doing your badges that are assigned to your regional. The Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act is doing planned regional economies. They're going to put you on a pathway for workforce training, and are you getting your badges? That debt is going to be securitized too, and they're just going to keep you in a loop, because if you're doing like gig economy globotics, you're always going to have to be reskilled. That's what they're saying. With AI, it's going faster, faster, faster. Like, any skill you have is going to be redundant in a couple of months. So, you have to always be reskilled, and then that's more and more of a market. And the crazy thing is, a lot of the training is going to be funded through income sharing agreements, and they're going to advance that as the answer to student loan debt. Oh, well, someone will pay for your training, and then when you get a job, they'll garnish your wages. And even in New Jersey, the New Jersey governor is advancing career impact bonds that will garnish not only your wages for your situation, but your social welfare. And the person who's securitizing the debt, his name is Christopher Riccardelli. Christopher Riccardelli created, he collateralized the obligations, the ones that crashed the housing market. Now he's the one behind Edley, and he's securitizing your income sharing agreements. So why in the world not more people are talking about this, right? It is pretty clear the people who wrecked it last time are going to wreck it this time, only this time it's even more directly involving you personally. So this is sort of the end. But what is our moral responsibility? To look up from the sandwiches. We've got, to me, natural life. Okay, I'm sort of picturing, I don't know why I have this picture got so bad, but it's like advanced manufacturing, right? All of these robots. If you imagine natural life is this assembly line, like it's like postmortem. We're the cars. And like, are we allowing this? Like, how much do we allow? Like, who's running this factory? Where is it going? Like, what's at the end of the assembly line? Because what they're looking at is a global, industrially engineered social system for militarized hedge funds. And I will say, like, I think that what we need to come at this with is like love and faith and spirit and grounding in sort of a sacred community, and to build that back. I have a friend, and she does these love bombs, so I try to leave like little love messages around, like, don't be desperate. This hasn't all happened yet. You know, I'm coming today to tell you what other people are in their minds, and they may not be able to pull it off, and that would be fabulous. And then we would just be, that's great. Like, then I won't have to do this anymore. But I think it's very bad if we just look the other way and we don't know this. So, you know, I get a lot of people that reach out to me, and I had some people who were, one day I woke up and I said, I need to go to John Coltrane's house. Like, he's another one of these amazing Philadelphians that people, well, he lived in Philadelphia for a number of years before he moved to New York, but he has a house. It's about a 20-minute walk from my place. And I said, I need to go there. It's abandoned. Like, they haven't been able to raise any money for, like, nobody wants to fundraise for a revolutionary musician. But someone called and they wanted to, like, they were appreciating my work, and they said, can I pray for you? And I said, sure, you know, I could use all the help I can get. And they did. And then I ended up going up to the house that night, and the papers were on the wall, and this is what it said, because it was one of his premier works is A Love Supreme. And it says, it is merciful, thank you, God. One thought can produce millions of vibrations, and they all go back to God. Everything does. Thank you, God. Have no fear, believe. Thank you, God. The universe has many wonders. God is all. And so I just do feel like we are the vibrations. Like, we're here today to make these thousands of vibrations. Like, you know, you guys are probably the biggest group I've talked to. I talk to small groups of people, and we vibrate out. And I do believe that the world is not meant to go this way. So we are powerful. If you need help, I would highly recommend this book. This is a wonderful woman. Her name is Robin Wall-Kimmerer. She's a professor of biology at the SUNY Forestry School, and she's a citizen Potawatomi Nation, and her specialty is moss. And so she talks about the shitagan, the embers, carrying the embers. It's a tinder fungus. So when her people were pushed out of upstate New York to the Great Lakes, they carried their fire in this fungus, and it just kept going. And so, like, I think what we need to do is keep the embers going, and with the hope, like, it would be great to see the bonfire of this catch and sort of this new world to be made that is against an industrial engineered society. But if we don't keep the embers going, then the people who come after us won't have that. So that's our job. We may or may not see the bonfire, but we're the ember keepers. If we can see the thing, if we're looking up from the sandwiches, this is our thing. And this is a beautiful book. It's a very maternal book about the world and being good relatives. Not only because the decisions we make today are not just about people, they're about the moss, they're about the bees, they're about everything. So John Trudell is of inspiration to me. He was a leader in the American Indian movement, and he says that we have the responsibility to use the intelligence given to us by the Creator to face the violence of the machine of tech, no logic, he calls it, as generations have done before. And, I had another friend who was talking about banking the fire. It was cold on the East Coast last week, and he said, had a fire going, and I, banked the embers at night, and just this idea of, like, being close together and supporting one another. And so I think that's what we're called to do now. And they're trying to spread out the embers and kill the fire, but we shouldn't let that happen. So I thank you for your time. I would just say, it's kind of below, but I spent some time this summer on the Cheyenne River Reservation with a woman who was doing food sovereignty work and food justice work there, and is in great need. She's a wonderful woman who worked for 20 years in nonprofits and environmentalism and realized it was just not what she thought it was. So she went home. And so anyway, her name is Chaz Jewett, and if anyone feels inclined to support. I don't need any financial support of this. I just do this on my own dime to tell people because I think they need to know. But if I can leverage my voice to support other people who are doing the really on-the-ground work, Chaz would be one. And she's at Chaz-Jewett-1 at Venmo. So anyway, thank you.
Did you want to answer any questions?
It's time. I kind of lost track of time.
Lowell has a microphone, and he will hand it to you if you have a question. And if you need to rush home because you got a babysitter, we're not going to fault you for that. So I'll give the mic back to Allison.
So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on colleges, because I've stopped going since March, and I was thinking, well, maybe I'll just do an online program, so then I won't have to take a vaccine or get tested. But obviously, like, then I would also be data mined, so it seems like there's no solution to that.
Yeah, it's hard. I have a 19-year-old, and we're navigating that too. I mean, they're an adult, so they have to make their own choices. I mean, I feel like in many ways the education system feeds into this system because they're aiding and abetting it. And I don't want to be that way, because like I was always good at school like, until I realized what was happening, you know. And so part of it is like I feel like we need to figure out what world we want. Like, what is the world that we want, rather than having them feed us the world that they intend. And I know that's not the easiest thing, but like I would hate in this world, there's like the people who will, it seems to me, the billionaires and their robots, and then there'll be a layer of the data analysts and the sort of the people administering the managerial class, and there'll be a whole lot of people who will be oppressed, people who aren't used to being oppressed. I'm not really used to being oppressed. That's why I'm coming out here. Like, I'm a pretty privileged person, and I can see that this machine is coming after everyone. Like, unless you have maybe tens of millions of dollars, you're going to be in this lower level. And so the idea that if my child could like be successful, then they get to be the oppressor. That's a terrible model. Like you be the oppressor, you can succeed and be the oppressor, you know. Then, so I wish I had a good answer. I mean, I don't know if there's other people in your peer group, like others that you can talk to, because I do feel that the youth are the ones ultimately who should decide. Like I mean, with our help, but we kind of mess things up a lot of this, like, you know, or we let things go on too far. So, you know, I would be interested in hearing the world you guys want, because that's what, you know, I think that's what we should be listening to. But I wish I thought that the current educational model was going to support that. But I think it's meant to really, I don't know how long it will last, actually. Like, there's part of me, my child is in second year college, and I'm like, is it going to last 2 more years? You know, there are some state systems that I think are intentionally being imploded, and for this new sort of badge-based model. So I would just encourage, like, talk to people about it. Like, say, like, this is, you know, because I don't have one answer. Like, I think we have to build the answer together. And I don't think that the current system brought us to this point. So, if that helps.
Who's the George Soros and Bill Gates on our team? It seems like all the money moves to the dark side, right? So, who's supporting our side?
Well, I guess part of me, I sort of feels like that it's probably hard to be a moral billionaire. Like, once you get up to $1 billion, that's kind of that you've made a choice to hold a lot of assets. I mean, to me, I think it's really grassroots. It's regular people that are going to be the ones, and it's that will make the difference, because those are I mean, we ultimately have to agree to let this happen. Like, we ultimately have to agree. Like, there's more of us than them, right? And so we have to be able to talk to the people who are in positions of authority to convince them of what's happening. Like, how many police officers or military people do you think want to be a robot? Probably not many. So what does it take to mobilize people? And I think some of this is healing, because the current media landscape has fragmented people so much from one another that they don't see the humanity in each other on across the spectrum. So we're much easier to manage by those darker forces, the billionaires. I don't think we should look to the people with lots of money to be our heroes. I mean, to me, I don't know. I think I become increasingly anarchist as I go along. I'm like, we need to be our own heroes, and we need to find each other, and we need to love each other, and we need to be open to learning from each other, because that's what this has taught me is listening and learning from a lot of different people's life experiences and trying to build this new thing. And knowing that we need to, at the same time, be mindful and careful that we're not just protecting ourselves and our families and our community, but those people who are least able to protect themselves, because they're really at the front and center. The people who have been harmed the most over time are going to be at the front and center of this impact market. They're going to be the front. So.
Is it me, or does Jeff Bezos kind of look like Lex Luthor?
I don't know. Maybe we should get the genomic profiling.
I've been reading about this transhumanist idea for a while, and it seems like you've put all the pieces together. Can you explain how far down the road we've traveled in transhumanism? I know that all the universities have transhumanist clubs where they believe in this salvation model. Through this connection of, some people call this singularity, where you're connecting humans with computers and upgrades and all of these types of ideas. And I know Elon Musk with the Starlink and the Neuralink, he's trying to connect you to the internet and all this matrix type technology. How far down the road of transhumanism have we gone, and what is the connection to all of this that you're talking about with however far down the road we've gone?
Well, I think it's hard to know exactly how much of what they've put out is already in place. I mean, we know that, military technologies or things, they have things developed, decades before the public knows anything about them. And I mean, what really most concerned me was looking into the Nano Robotics and in the programs with, other people are more knowledgeable about the graphene and the hydrogel and self-assembling systems, because I was really concerned when my child came home. They were really worried and wanting to get a test, and I said, I really don't want you to get the test. I'm concerned about those swabs. I don't know about the DNA. I don't know about, there's questions if they're contaminated and with what, because the blood-brain barrier is that key point of transmission. And I had to say, I worry about cyborgs. And, it's crazy to have to tell your 19-year-old about cyborgs. And they're like, well, what would you know? What cyborgs? And, they're probably thinking somebody with, a robotic arm or something. And I'm like, it could be these, you might never know. We may all be cyborgs already, and we might not know it. If there's nanorobotics, in the environment. And, Penn has this giant nanotechnology institute. There's this National Nanotechnology Initiative where they say nanoparticles, they don't behave according to our commonly understood laws of physics. And yet they're saying, we're going to use it to do water purification. I'm like, do we want nanotechnology in the water cycle? Have we done enough to even know what that would mean? And actually I emailed Robin Wall-Kimmerdick, who loves moss, because their reproductive cycle is through water. And I said, do the moss people know about nanotechnology water cleaning? Do you know about that's happening? So, I think a lot is conditioning, too. I'm working with some people. We're trying to find a shorter way to say this, but we're talking about this idea of CITE, C-I-T-E, capture, inject, trace, erase. And that before the capture is sort of the enrapture. You have to, either through fear or propaganda, sell this vision. And the media has been very effective in selling both fear and the normalization of stuff. And the gaming industry is hugely important, because some of it is not just physical, mechanical nanorobotics, but it's this avatar. And I will say that the thing that's really disturbing to me is that in 2016, the DNC was in Philadelphia, and Atlantic Magazine had a bunch of panel discussions all week. They rented a sports bar, and you could come, and one of them was on the future of education, the creative economy. And it was Suzanne DelBene, who's a congresswoman from Washington State, who's the head of the Internet of Things Caucus. And there was a woman who's a professor of video gaming who was at Wisconsin-Madison and now at UC Irvine. And our progressive city council person, and this guy, I think his name is Tim Megan from Epic Games, and the announcer. And essentially, the guy from Epic Games just kept saying, we need the kids to code our video games. We need the kids to code our video games. And I was like, well, that seems pretty narrow, that they need the kids. But then I realized about a year later, he actually meant they need the kids to code the virtual world. He needs the kids to, somebody has to code this into existence. This augmented reality, Niantic, augmented cities, someone has to actually do the coding. It doesn't just, there's bits and pieces here, but it hasn't fully been implemented. And so they needed the kids to build this virtual world, which they would live in avatars. And 6G technology is coming after 5G, and that's for robot-to-robot communication and digital twinning. And that's being advanced, the digital twinning, and it's through SoftBank, which is a major financial institution in Japan, and they're running they have the largest tech VC fund, which is like $93 billion, is last I noticed, and they're doing the Saudi money, and they're pushing robotics and AI. And then there's NTT, Nippon Telegraph and Telephone and Telegraph. They're pushing digital twinning of society. So they're actually trying to create like these multiverses. And I don't know how far it is. I don't know when all these little bits and pieces that are disconnected will connect. But I think that the biometric digital passports, the linking of our DNA and our access and the data mining is part of that.
We have time for 2 more questions. Here's one.
Hi. So the way I see it is the slaves in Egypt weren't going to convince Pharaoh to change his system. And what you've described here, we already know we're not going to convince billionaires to change the system. And you're not even probably going to reach legislators because we've been trying for a long time. So at the end of the day, the way I see it is the slaves have to just walk away.
Yeah.
So I was a public school teacher, and I had the most surreal day of my life when I sat in that first faculty meeting back in August. 4 hours. I've been to faculty meetings for 24 years. I spent 4 hours talking about the mask. And I was one of 2 teachers in the whole state, and there are thousands and thousands, to walk away.
Yeah.
I left, I was 24 years in. 1 more year I would have had my district retirement. So at some point, every one of you had better get the moral courage to walk away from this, because they're never going to listen to you. Yeah. There's no way. Joe, none of these people, and you know what? Not even my school superintendent was going to listen. And when I sat in front of that I went to the school district meeting that they had before they fired me and made my testimony against them that stands before God, because this is evil. Yeah. And they participated. And what I learned after teaching the Holocaust for 24 years was that it's not the big people that are the problem. I mean, they're the problem. Yeah. The problem is anyone here that's supporting it, which is probably all of us in some way, but you can't wear a mask, because if you continue to wear a mask, that's part of the problem. You can't social distance. Yeah. So my question, it's just my statement.
No, it's appreciated.
Because I'm telling you, I know how real it is. And I'm going to use a Utah term, I saw a gadiant and robber on that school board, because the spirit was strong, because I testified and my friend testified, and he was nervous when he felt that Holy Spirit come in that room. And he took his mask down, and he reminded everyone on that school board why they had better stay in line. And when I say gadiant, I mean mafia, or whatever you want to call it. And the dark force on that board, and he was the lawyer, by the way, and he reminded them of all the reasons they had better not listen to that spirit that was touching them. And it was money. At the end of the day, it was all money. Yeah. And so if you cannot soften the heart of a school board in little old Utah County, where I'm from, you got big problems. I mean, we got big, big problems. And it's the people that are the problem. So my question for you is, since I'm gonna obviously walk away, and I'm not gonna opt in for any of their stuff, what are they gonna do with me? Because I'm not gonna participate. So I'm not gonna do their little stuff. Do they have a really nice torture room for me?
They might reprogram you with virtual reality.
Well, then I ask God to instantly take me, because I'm not going along.
I know. Well, I appreciate that.
Thank you for your stand. Thank you. I agree. It's
Okay, one last question.
In summary, non-agreement isn't going to be enough. Passive acquiescence is all it will take So, as we've heard here, we need deliberate decisions strongly made for our independence. Non-agreement is not enough.
Do you have a question? Let's try another question or an answer.
I have an answer, and little bits and pieces were presented. One was about the number of billionaires. There's only so many, and they don't have much of a vote. Each one has a vote, and that doesn't add up too much. We have the votes. They have only their votes plus any of the dupes they could get to vote their way, which is a lot of them. But we have something they don't have. What they have is they have Luciferian-owned networks that could reach millions of people. And we're not billionaires. How many of us own networks that could reach billions of people? Okay, none. But there's more of us than there are of them. We could talk to people.
Yeah.
They can't do that. There's only so many of them. They could only broadcast through their networks. But we could go up to people, have conversations, get to understand them, make our presentations to them the way they would understand us. We should do that.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another round of applause for Alison McDowell. Thank you for coming. Be safe on the road home.